It was interesting that we were just talking about computers and the internet, because there's a fascinating book, came out in the late 1990s, called The Talmud and the Internet. And the author is attempting to try and draw parallels between the way the internet works with links and hyperlinks and multi-source documents, and the way that the Talmud works in Jewish life, with the idea that there is an original teaching, but there are also later teachings and new insights, and they can all be presented on the same page as a kind of hypertextual linkage from one generation to the other. And as we'll see, there's a bit of truth in that too. It's a very interesting read, but the phenomenon of Jewish life after the closing of the canon is especially important to understand Rabbinic Judaism and modern Judaism. You know, you sometimes will get people who come from a Christian background who say, oh, we honor all of Judaism because we have the whole Old Testament. No, you honor Judaism up to the time the Septuagint branched off. Remember, we talked last time about how the Hebrew Bible and even the Old Testament are not exactly the same because of the order of books, and some books included. And if you're Catholic, you have books in there that the Jews don't have, and so on. So Jewish life continued after the canon was closed because we had more to say. And we had more arguments to have and more questions to explore and new circumstances to grapple with. You know, just because you decide the canon is closed doesn't mean you don't have more creative ideas coming out. I mean, this happens even in modern literature. There's a whole genre of online blog literature, basically, that's called fan fiction. So you have fan fiction that imagines what happened if Harry Potter did this, or what would happen if Frodo from the Lord of the Rings showed up in modern day London. And so you write this fan fiction where you take the characters and maybe put them in outlandish circumstances, but you want to find more stories about them and have those characters appear in new ways. In a very different kind of parallel, I've been rewatching the TV show Lost, which was on TV in the early 2000s. And it turns out there are episodes I didn't see when it came out the first time. So it's like fan fiction. I get new versions of stories with the same characters that I knew, and I now understand more about them. Because the more you know about the character, the more it deepens who they are and your understanding of what they do. So as we'll see, this is the case for rabbinic literature as well. Just because the canon is closed doesn't mean that you are done thinking about what to do, in particular because of the radical changes that took place in Jewish life around the same time the canon was closed. Just to remind you, if you took the history class, or to let you know if you didn't, Jewish life changes radically in the year 70 of the Common Era, because that's when the Jerusalem temple is destroyed. This is actually technically the second temple that was built around the year 500 BCE and lasted all the way to the year 70 of the Common Era. So if the Septuagint canon is closed around the year 200 BCE, and the last of the books that make it into the Hebrew Bible, maybe the book of Daniel, are written around the year, let's say 180 BCE or 160 BCE, they're written when the temple still stands in Jerusalem. And so they presume that the animal sacrifices will continue to be offered, that the priests will be in charge of Jewish life, that there is a clear pilgrimage and a place to go for these kind of rituals, and tradition reigns. And God lives in Jerusalem. It's the place where he will cause his name to dwell, to use the phrasing that's used in the Torah. Well, after 70 of the Common Era, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the Jewish people are scattered and dispersed in the aftermath of the Great Revolt. What are they to do? Well, this is around the same time the rabbis make their decision to compile their canon of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. That's about the year 90 of the Common Era in that town of Yavne. Notice they didn't meet in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a smoking wreck, or at least barely starting to rebuild. So here you have this canon closed. You've gotten all the laws that are in the Torah that focus on the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem. But now what do we do? It comes to Shabbat. We're supposed to offer a special sacrifice. Well, there's no altar in Jerusalem. It's the day rises, or the holiday appears, the holiday of Sukkot. We were supposed to dwell in sukkahs and offer all these animal sacrifices all these days. What are we supposed to do? And what the rabbis came up with were substitutes for the ritual in the temple. The ritual in the temple was sometimes referred to as avodah. Avodah today means labor or work, but it also meant service, like an eved was a servant or even a slave. And so the service in the temple was the animal sacrifices. But now the rabbis shift that, and they decide that instead of sacrificing animals, we're going to sacrifice words. And we'll prescribe specific words, just like we had specific animals prescribed for specific sacrifices. So we will have some words that are designed to praise the Hebrew God, some words that are designed to petition or ask for something from the Hebrew God, and some words that are designed to offer gratitude. And they'll be specific. We will have a daily prayer service. And then on Shabbat, we will have a musaf, an additional prayer service, because you would have a daily sacrifice and a musaf, additional sacrifice on Shabbat. We will have special readings prescribed for the holidays, many of which are the readings that describe the sacrifices. So on the first day of Sukkot, a special Torah reading is given of the sacrifices for Sukkot. It's almost as if they're saying to the Hebrew God, God, I want you to know that I know what I'm supposed to do. I know I'm supposed to be offering these animals. I can't, right? The temple's not there and you haven't rebuilt it yet. So this is the best I can do, is I can read what I'm supposed to do, even if I can't actually do it. It was a reminder of that moment. So that was step one, was offering sacrifices in place of, sacrifices of words in place of animal sacrifices. The second thing they did was they came up with a new way to serve God. Remember, God told you what to do with your life. He wrote a manual. It's called the Torah. More broadly, the Tanakh. We talked about how the word Torah can have a broader sense too. But the core place to focus is on that Torah that was given to Moses. And by this time, there's a consensus in Jewish life that this Torah is the Torah that Moses got. So what you can do to find out what God wants you to do in this new world is you can turn back to that book and you can study it and you can try to understand what it means. After all, just because it's God's word, it doesn't mean you know what it means. So it says, thou shalt not murder in the 10 Commandments. What counts as murder? Do not commit adultery. Well, is it adultery if I look at her? Like what, well, then maybe that's coveting. And how do you draw the lines there? How do you prove coveting? And what is the atonement for that? Well, there's all kinds of legalistic questions to explore. There are all sets of whole sets of commandments in this Torah. The rabbis imagined there were 613 of them, although they didn't all agree on what those 613 were. And there's arguments over what counts and what doesn't and where it belongs. We'll see some examples of that actually a bit later. But what if there's a conflict? So what if it says, honor your mother and father, but your parents are thieves? Do you honor them and not turn them in? Do you violate a different commandment that says, do not sit idly by while your brother commits sin and allow them to continue to sin by stealing? Well, this requires some resolution. What if it says, do no work on the Sabbath, but you have to do work to save someone's life on the Sabbath? Are you allowed to break the Sabbath to save a life? And if so, why? What's your reason? What's your either reason or what's your proof text? The whole phenomenon of proof texting is really fascinating because the rabbis will say, from where in scripture do we know X? From where in the Torah do we know you can break the Shabbat to save a life? So notice the phrasing there. They already know that you can break Shabbat to save a life. They just want to know, from where can I prove it? From what source can I get there? So it's like reasoning backwards, sort of like people who want there to be the right of an individual to carry a firearm, and then they have to go back into the Second Amendment to try to dig it out. Or people who want there to be a right of privacy in the Constitution to justify contraception and abortion, but it's not explicitly enumerated. So they have to read it into some of the amendments in the 14th Amendment and some other places that they find justification for this as implicit in the text. But of course, one person's implicit in the text is another person's reading the hell out of the text and putting whatever you want in there. So there's an academic distinction between exegesis and eisegesis. Exegesis is reading out of the text. Eisegesis is reading something into the text. But one person's one is someone else's the opposite. So, there is this parallel to our experience of constitutional law, where you have a foundational document, but now you need somebody to tell you what it means. And one of the key questions is, what's more important, what it says or what you say it means? And in reality, it's what you say it means is what goes. And that makes the rabbis in some ways almost more powerful than the Torah itself. So if they see an example of a law that's just not workable, for example, in Deuteronomy, it says, a stubborn and rebellious child should be stoned to death. Well, if you've had a child or you've been a child, you know that this would mean the end of humanity, because this happens all the time, right? Go to any grocery store and you'll see one or two examples of kids flailing on the floor and whatever. So we understand that this is not a workable rule as written. So what do the rabbis do with it? Well, first they say, well, it says here, a ben sorero more, a stubborn and rebellious child, but could really be son, because it's the male form. So it doesn't apply to girls. So they've already saved half of the children, right? Then they say, well, it says son, but when they're a minor, they're not liable for the death penalty. That's not the case in anything else. But once they're an adult, they're not really a child anymore in the same way. So there's really this limited window of time when they're eligible. And they actually use the phrasing, from the time when he grows 2 hairs till the beard all around. But they were talking about the lower beard. That's the phrasing they use. So that's their window. It's like bar mitzvah plus or minus 5 days or something like that. So there's like a limited window where they apply the law. And then they go into more depth. It says in the rulings in the Torah that the mother and father must bring him out. So they both have to agree. And they have to bring him out. So they have to be physically able to do it. If they're lame or otherwise disabled, then it doesn't qualify. And then they can't be deaf and they can't be blind. They have to take him to 3 judges and have the 3 judges whip him and warn him. And then if he does it again, they have to take him to 21 judges who verified with the first 3 judges that this is the same kid. And only then does it finally. So again, you narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down. And so finally, at the end of the discussion in the Talmud, one rabbi says, there never was a stubborn and rebellious child, and there never will be. Like, no one's ever going to qualify for this. And then another rabbi says, well, there was one, and I saw him, and I sat on his grave. Like, I know it happened. It did happen once. But then they say, well, why is this in the Torah at all? And the answer is very illustrative. It says, so you should study and receive your reward. How is God keeping score? How does he know if you're a good person and you're fulfilling the commandments or doing what he wants you to do? Well, before, to do what he wants you to do, you went to the temple, you offered the sacrifices, the priest did it all, right? You brought the animal when you needed to, and they took care of everything. But now there's no priest, there's no sacrifices, there's no intermediary between you and the cosmic judge. So how do you know what to do and what not to do? How do you earn points? You earn points by fulfilling commandments. And you understand the commandments by studying the source of the commandments, the law book, and that's the Torah. So you're studying the Torah to know how to do the laws, and then you fulfill the commandments in various different ways. And of course, there are always new circumstances, like elevators. Okay. Or automobiles, or electricity, or pogroms, or, you don't have to have modern inventions, or there are creative people. So here's an example. It says that in the Torah, you shall not kindle a fire on Shabbat. And the way the rabbis interpreted it was, if you had it lit before, you can leave it lit, like you light Shabbat candles, and those stay lit. But you can't light a new fire on Shabbat, and you can't put one out on Shabbat. In fact, there's even some discussion over if your house catches on fire, should you put it out or leave? Because you're not supposed to put out fires. In any case, in that case, the saving a life sort of takes precedence. So people would put out the fire because you don't want to risk the firefighters' lives. You don't want to risk your neighbors' lives, So there are reasons to do that. But in the case of the kindling of fire, so some clever, smart ass out there came up with a new idea. So let's say you have an oil lamp and you hang a bag of oil over the lamp, and you poke a hole in the bottom of that bag, so every few minutes a drop of oil drips out. And so now your oil lamp that's burning below is continually refueled by this automatic machine that you've created. Are you violating the law of you will not kindle a fire because you're causing it to be rekindled? You're adding fuel to the fire. On the other hand, it's happening by itself. It's automatic. So you don't need a mechanical timer on your light switch or on the oven. Rabbis have been coming up with this kind of stuff for a long time. Now, sometimes that cleverness is for the purposes of good, and sometimes that cleverness is for bad purpose, or for annoying purpose. There's even a famous story where a rabbi was thrown out of the house of study because they were debating the laws of lost animals. There's a ruling in the Torah that says if an animal is lost, you bring it back to its owner. But how can you define if an animal is lost? And they decided, well, you draw a line about 50 cubits away from the person's household. And if an animal is within 50 cubits, it's not lost. And if it's beyond 50 cubits, it counts as lost. And then the rabbi said, well, what if it has 1 foot on one side of the line and 1 foot on the other side of the, and for that reason, he was thrown out of the house of study. So sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's splitting hairs. But even that is seen as a positive. There's a praiseworthy rabbinic student who can find 50 different ways that a creepy crawly insect is kosher, even though it's explicitly defined as not kosher. But that's seen as praiseworthy because you're using reason to try to refine things. You're sharpening the edge of your reason on this nonsense case to be able to use it for real things and to come up with interesting new insights. And there's a sense that being part of that process is, in fact, part of an ongoing revelation, because the rabbis have a new concept. In the earlier literature, it's called the Traditions of the Fathers, but ultimately it becomes called the Oral Torah. According to the rabbis, there are 2 Torahs given at signing: a written Torah, which is the book that we have now, and an oral Torah, which includes both extra teachings not included in that written book, but just passed down by word of mouth, and also how to read the book. So the oral Torah is the how you interpret it. It's the rituals and procedures and rules of interpretation for mining into that Torah text. And I use that example on purpose. You know, when you buy a piece of land, you buy the mineral rights below it in many cases. You know, think of like the Beverly Hillbillies, where he shot at some food and up from the ground came a bubbling crude and he owned the oil and now they're all rich. Well, it's because he owns everything below his land. Well, this is the case for the Torah too. You receive the Torah, there's a surface meaning to it, but you can mine down below that surface meaning and find all kinds of other interpretations that were always there. Remember, God wrote it. So there can be multiple layers of meanings to be discovered. And if you read it in the future, it's as if it was being revealed from the past. There's a sense that sometimes there's one phrase in the Talmud: whatever a student will innovate before his teacher in the future was already given at Mount Sinai. It was implicit in that revelation all the way back then. So I'll share with you one example of a text that talks about this in some detail, and we'll come back to it a bit later as well. Okay, so this is from a section of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. And at the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, it says, Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. This is not necessarily the written Torah. This is most likely referring to the oral Torah, this word of mouth passing down. In fact, the word for pass down here is misaruha. They gave it it's the word for masoret, for tradition in modern Hebrew. And they said 3 things: be patient in justice, raise many students, disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. Simon the Righteous was one of the last men of the great assembly, and he used to say, so he's adding to it, right? He's adding new sayings that get passed down. On 3 things the world stands: al ha-Torah, on the Torah; al ha-Avodah, the service, remember the work, right? But again, that's translated from temple service to the prayer service. Al gemilut chasadim, and the acts of piety. Antigonus of Socho received this from Shimon the Righteous. And he used to say, Do not be like servants who serve the master expecting to receive a reward. Be like servants who serve without the expectation of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you. And then so on. They keep receiving the tradition, and they keep adding their own sayings to it. So the Oral Torah is not a fixed body of one set of laws that's there forever. It's a process. And sometimes it claims to go back all the way to Moses on Sinai. They'll say, from where do we know this rule? It's a law that goes back to Moses. We don't know when anybody started, but they claim it goes back to Moses on Sinai. That's that Oral Torah from the beginning. But also their interpretations are seen as part of the Oral Torah because they're using the interpretive techniques that were passed down as the Oral Torah. So you get the idea. Oral Torah is both a body of law and a way of interpreting the written law. And sometimes you try to harmonize the two, and sometimes they stand sort of parallel to each other. Now, most of this is passed down by word of mouth, starting around the year 200 BCE and going all the way to around the year 200, 220 of the Common Era. So about a 400, 450-year period where these proto-rabbis and early rabbis are receiving traditions they've learned from the past. They are then adding their own interpretations and canons of law and so on. Ultimately, though, Jewish life is becoming more and more dispersed. Remember, there are great revolts that take place in the 2nd century of the Common Era. First, there's a diaspora revolt from 115 to 117 of the Common Era, then the Bar Kokhba revolt in Israel again from 132 to 135, which devastates the country and again disperses the Jews very widely. So with Jews being dispersed widely and Jews now living in two major empires, some in the Roman Empire and some to the east in the Parthian or Sasanian Empire in what is now Iraq and then Babylon or Baghdad, ultimately under the Arabs. They need some kind of unifying context. So that's one of the reasons the Tanakh is compiled. They have a scripture, but now they need a sense of law, a sense of practice that's going to work. The synagogue, by the way, predates the destruction of the temple. So there may have been the rudiments of some of this rabbinic law even earlier, the beginnings of a Passover Seder, the beginnings of a Shabbat reading of the Torah. That may predate the destruction of the temple, but it certainly accelerates once there is no temple and the rabbis and their interpretations in the house of meeting, aka synagogue, are all that's left. So the rabbis begin to start to collect these oral teachings. And ultimately, they make the decision to write them down, which is controversial because this is the Oral Torah. What are you doing writing down the Oral Torah? But the volume of teaching has become so big that it's almost impossible to remember it all. You actually have to hire reciters who come in and recite the law when you say, pull this up. And, lest you think that's ridiculous, people's oral memory and ability to recall and repeat, if you look at storytellers in many different cultures, they have volumes and volumes committed to memory that they can repeat word for word over and over again. So it is certainly doable when you don't have a smartphone to distract you. So now that we have this body of law that's so big, they have to write it down and they need to organize it in some way. And so ultimately, this is collected into the first volume of rabbinic literature, which is called the Mishnah. And it comes from that word for repeating, because this is what the repeaters would repeat. So I'm going to show you the table of contents for the Mishnah and its basic organization, because it'll demonstrate how they organize their thought, so to speak. So the Mishnah is divided into 6 Seder, 6 orders, or 6 major section headings. And then each Seder, each block, is divided into specific what are called Masecha, or division. And then within each Masecha, there are specific, this is confusing, Mishnahs, specific teachings that fit in there. Just like we had the word Torah could mean the full book or a specific law, same thing for Mishnah, unfortunately. So here you have the first order, which is agriculture or seeds. And within that section on agriculture, you have a section on blessings, a section on leaving the corner of the field and how you define that. Someone who's suspected of neglected tithing and what do you do? The prohibition of the mixing of certain seeds and plants and how is that interpreted? The 7th year of the agricultural cycle, which we're actually in right now. The required donations of agricultural produce to the priestly household. And often a lot of these have to do with sacrifices that aren't even done anymore, but they still want to clarify the law. Tithes for priests and the Levites, separating the challah from the dough when you're baking bread to give to the priest or to burn up in the oven without the priesthood there. The giving of first fruits. So all of the agricultural laws are part of that chapter, that section. The next section is Moed Holidays. And here you have Shabbat. the seventh day. You have Eruvin, which is defining the closed areas in which you're allowed to carry or travel during Shabbat. Pesachim is Passover. Yomah is Yom Kippur. Sukkah is for the Sukkah. Holidays, holiday laws about what the pieces can be used is in the category of Beitzah, which means egg, actually. Megillah is for Esther. Chagigah is the festival sacrifices. Rosh Hashanah is the new year. So you've got a division by the specific holidays, and even the fasting days have their own section. Now we have the Seder Nashim. It's called here family law. Nashim literally means women. So just like, you used to have the male as the demo example of anatomy, and then the woman was the special case. Well, in rabbinic law, it works the same way, because you have the section on women is the special use case, or how they define family law. So here we have categories under women. Ketubas, the marriage contract. Yivamot, what do you do with the levirate marriage when a man dies childless? What about vows that are taken? A Nazirite who vows abstinence from certain things. Laws relating to divorce, the woman suspected of adultery. How do you marry somebody, and so on. So all of those are in the category called women, because it's when your life deals with women. These other categories, by the way, all these holiday things, women are not necessarily involved in that. So that's why they land in a separate category, if you're a man thinking how this works. The section on damages. Remember, Jewish law is not only ritual things like dietary laws or sacrifices, it's all of law. So they have judicial systems dealing with disputed property, returning lost objects, liability and compensation for damages, relationships between neighbors, land ownership and inheritance. What's the judicial system? How do you handle oaths? What counts as idolatry? How do you manage business interactions between Jews and non-Jews who are assumed to be idolaters? How do you handle punishments, lashing, false witnesses, et cetera, et cetera? Even dealing with erroneous rulings of the court. What's the appeal system? What if the leaders sin? Right? They're trying to envision all the circumstances possible. Then there's a whole section on sacrifices. Again, fascinating, given they're not doing them for most of the period that this law is collected from. And then finally, the last one is the section on purity laws. So everything from vessels to the purification ritual of the red heifer, what happens with a corpse's impurity, what about ritual baths and becoming purified, women's menstrual impurity. You'd think that would belong in the women's section, but because the purity laws are all collected in one place, they put it here. The washing of hands is a whole section. So here you get this large volume of laws that are the starting point for rabbinic discussions. But even they are not the ending point for rabbinic discussions, because guess what? Even after the Mishnah is done, there's more to say because new arguments and new discussions and new circumstances of what do they mean by this, and how do they define this, and how does this connect to the written Torah? Often the Mishnah will just state a law and not make a connection. And it's a later commentary that tries to figure out where they got this from and what's the biblical source for this, because they assume those two have to be synonymous. A scholar named Jacob Neuser was very eloquent in writing about his theory that the Mishnah was written as the Oral Torah, freestanding. It didn't need to be connected to the written Torah, but later generations felt the need to do that. So you have a body of teachings that didn't make it into the Mishnah, just like those books that didn't make it into the Tanakh. They're called baraitas, or like outside sources. And ultimately, the Mishnahs and some of the baraitas make their way into the next collection, because those commentaries, those discussions keep happening. This Mishnah is closed 200 to 220 of the Common Era, but rabbis keep talking about it. They keep, wanting to add footnotes and explanations. And ultimately, it's around the year 500 to 550 of the Common Era that those commentaries and footnotes and connections to the written Torah are also collected into a volume that's put next to the Mishnah, and that's called the Gemara. Gemara means completion or finishing. And so if you have the Mishnah and the Gemara together, that is called the Talmud. So think of it as GMT. Gemara plus Mishnah equals Talmud. As I said, the Mishnah is the original rabbinic teachings, the Talmud is the commentary. So here you have an example of a diagram of what would be found in a Talmud volume. This is based on the Venice pagination, but it's the standard Vilna edition that was printed beginning, I believe, in the 18th century. And so they have it broken down by colors, but you can just notice in the typography here, you've got the main text, and then you've got all these commentary texts and little side notes and appendices and other commentaries around it. And so it is, as I said, this kind of hypertextual document, this linkage between past and present. So here's the color-coded version of it. So first you have the Mishnah, that early collection of law, and then you would have a section of the Gemara, which is the authoritative footnotes and commentary from that first generation of commentators. They're often divided into the Amoraim and the, I'm forgetting the name of the second generation. And then the Stamim are the final editors. But in any case, I can't believe I forgot it. Anyways, the Tanaim, that was it. The Tanaim and the Amoraim are the two generations of teachers. So if you're an earlier generation, generally the later generations don't totally reverse you, but they have to try to find a way to harmonize if they find conflicting teaching. So one rabbi says you should put on your right shoe, then your left. And the other rabbi says you should put on your left shoe, then your right. And another rabbi says whatever hand is dominant, that's the shoe you should put on first. And so the part of the Gemara's role is to try to say you're right and you're right. You're both right. It's that old rabbinic joke. It's not a joke in the Talmud. That's what they do. So the shoe thing is interesting. They say you should put on the left and the right, but you should tie the right and the left. So they find a way to split the difference. So here you have the Mishnah as this pink text. The sort of tan text is the Gemara, the rabbinic sort of commentary and footnotes of that first generation. But then there are other people in later generations that have things to add. So on the upper right text, you have this commentary by Rashi, who lived in northern France in 1040 to 1105. And sometimes that Rashi text is written in a different script. It's called Rashi script, but it's not called Rashi script because he wrote like that. It's not his handwriting, because it appears in a lot of other places too. It's a different script, so you can tell it apart from the Mishnah. So it's like a different font. You know, you do it in a radically different font, so we can tell the difference between the commentary and the original sources. But you also have commentary of Rashi's grandsons, a generation skipping after Rashi, the Tosafists in the light blue. Then you have notes by Rabbi Nissim ben Yaakov of Tunisia in the 11th century going around the bottom. Then you have also noticed some anonymous comments here and there. You have cross references to codes of Jewish law. So if you want to find out what's the law they're talking about, what am I supposed to do here? Like, this is reading the Supreme Court decision. I don't know what the law is. Go to a law code. They've put it down in black and white what you're supposed to do. There are also cross references to other parts of the Talmud. They might talk about the same thing. And even you'll notice these little sort of mauve pieces in the middle, in between the Rashi and the Gemara. Those are the Bible citations, because sometimes the rabbis won't even fill in the gaps. They'll just say, it's not good for man to be alone, but they won't tell you where that's from. And you have to know it. So some later generations added in the biblical citations so people could go look up the context, because sometimes they only quote part of the verse and they assume you know the rest of the verse, because again, they had memorized it in such a deep way. So here you have the sort of overview of the Talmud and how the page looks. And again, it wasn't always printed like this. Here's another example. This is printed in 1523 in Venice. You'll notice you have the Mishnah and the Gemara commentary, but you don't have all the other commentaries as clear around them, maybe in this sort of scripty stuff around the side, but it's not the same design. You don't have to print a Talmud in this design. This is just the most common version that people see today. So the Talmud itself is actually 63 tractates. It's not all the tractates in the Mishnah. Not every Mishnah has a Gemara attached to it. And there are two versions of the Talmud, because there were two major centers of Jewish learning, one based in Babylon, so it's called the Babylonian Talmud, and one based in the land of Israel. It's sometimes called the Jerusalem Talmud, even though they weren't in Jerusalem, or it's called the Palestinian Talmud, because that's what the Romans called the territory, Palestina. But neither one is particularly accurate. In Hebrew, it's called the Bavli, Babylonian, and the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem. But either way, people will know there are two different Talmuds. The Babylonian one is more complete because it had longer time to develop. The one in the Palestinian territory, the Jerusalem Talmud, was cut short because of the canceling of a major office by the now Christian Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire. And because of the persecution involved in that transition, Jewish life sort of had to pack up and move east. to really be creative. So the Palestinian Talmud didn't have as much time to develop. So it's not as authoritative as the Babylonian Talmud. And we'll see some examples of texts in sort of the second part of the class. We'll look at a few examples that were in the course packet. Now, two other kinds of rabbinic literature that take place. This is the law stuff. This is what's called Halacha. But there's a whole other style of interpretation called Agadah. And if Halacha means like the path, the way you walk, think of Sharia, by the way, similar kind of approach. The Agadah are the legends, the stories. Some people just find Agadah as whatever is not Halacha. It's just like the miscellaneous. So sometimes it's the re-envisioning of the storytelling. It's Abraham doing something you didn't expect, or God having a dialogue with Satan before he tests Abraham in the Akedah, sort of like Abraham as a new Job. That's part of the rabbinic commentary adding to the stories. But there's also things called Agadah that are the deeds of the rabbis. You know that phrase, what would Jesus do? Well, sometimes people will say, what would Rabbi Gamliel do? So one question they're debating is, you're not allowed to go from a public space to a private space and carry things on Shabbat. Well, what if you're on a boat and the boat lands on Shabbat? Are you allowed to walk down a gangplank off the boat? And they say one time Rabban Gamliel arrived at the port of whatever on Shabbat and he walked off the boat and went home. So even if they don't have a legal principle, if the lead rabbi of his era did it, it's probably okay. So sometimes the deeds of the rabbis are what's recorded there. And sometimes it's fascinating. You know, the stories of these rabbis interacting with each other, sometimes they are rivals, sometimes they threaten each other, their wives get involved in a lot of these issues as well. I mean, they're really fascinating narratives included in what is called Agadah, sort of this legendary material, but sometimes it also gives you clues to lived life. You know, so-and-so went to the marketplace and went to the bathhouse and was upset to find an Aphrodite statue there. What is a Jew doing going to the Roman bathhouse? But that's what they did. We know it from these stories that are told from this time period. So it's really a marvelous sort of primary source, to be used with a grain of salt, but still a primary source for lived life in this period, based on those kind of Agadic stories of the rabbis, in addition to whatever stories they would tell. And sometimes they would tell stories that reflected their own priorities and issues and projected back into those old stories. They imagined that King David studied the Torah. Well, from their chronology, it made sense, right? Because Moses got the Torah. Historically, David is centuries before the Torah is finally compiled, but that's our perspective. Of course, they also imagined that Abraham ate matzah. That doesn't even make sense in the biblical chronology, because Abraham is centuries before the Exodus, which is when they invent the matzah on the backs, right? But if Abraham was a good Jew, he ate matzah in the spring. You might not know why, but he cleaned out the chametz and he ate matzah. So this is the sort of timelessness of this concept, the idea that in some ways the Torah was the beginning of everything and was pre-existing the world, but also that the saints had to perform all the commandments as they were required. In fact, there's a hilarious video that I watch like once a year just to roll over and laughing, where somebody puts in this like auto-tuned voice, people asking these chutzpahdik questions. So so one person says to the rabbi figure, did the patriarchs fulfill every commandment? And they said, sure. Well, did Jacob the patriarch fulfill the commandment to write a full Torah scroll for himself? Well, of course he did. Well, then why did he think that they had killed his son Joseph? Couldn't he have read in the Torah that Joseph was just put into a pit and then sold into slavery and he'd meet him a few chapters later? But this is what happens when you're not thinking this through in a sort of logical, systematic way. But the world of Agadah is open and creative. And there's actually very interesting theories. Some people speculated in the 1980s that postmodern literary theory was a kind of midrash, because who cares what the author said? Whatever you read into the text is great, and they'd be creative. And so they found interesting parallels there. And the last example of rabbinic literature is the liturgy, the prayers, because the rabbis are putting this stuff together. Remember, they have to replace all this animal sacrifice. Ultimately, around the 9th century, they decided to compile it all into a specific order of what prayers are said when and how to say them. They're discussed in the Talmud, but the separate book of all the prayers put together is made a bit later, and it's called an order. And the word for order, you remember is Seder. but in a different voweling, it's Siddur. So a Siddur or Siddur is the prayer book with the prayers in a certain order. And remember, if you're going to talk to God, you better get it right and not say the wrong thing. So that's why they want to make sure they specify exactly what you're supposed to say in exactly the right order with exactly the right words. Now, as I mentioned, the major elements of this prayer book are praising God, petitioning God, or thanking God. By the way, that works on people too. If I needed to ask for a favor, I might say, Lori, you're so wonderful. You've done such wonderful things in the past. Could you please do this one favor for me? Thank you. You're such a great help. Okay. Praise, petition, thank you. So, flattery doesn't hurt. Now, one of our challenges as humanistic Jews is looking at this huge body of rabbinic prayer literature. I mean, we can find historical pieces in the Talmud. We find ethical rules in the Mishnah, as we'll see. We'll look at Pirkei Avot and find some good stuff there, even in the first chapter. The Agadah is creative literature and stories. Even the Halacha, the law, reflects lived life at the time. But the Siddur, the prayer book, with all this gaudy God. I mean, if you read some of the prayers, I would be embarrassed to have someone say that to me in my retirement event. It's so obsequious and flattering. So is it an expression of the human emotion sometimes? When they say, I long for you to save me from all these, well, that's a human emotion being expressed. We might direct the prayer differently, or the hope differently, or the wishes or the aspirations differently. We might use different vocabulary. We might not say prayer, but we might have hope, aspiration, and have that mean what we mean. And we might also not feel the need to bless everything all the time. So one of the most stereotypical rabbinic literature pieces is Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, our God, Eloheinu melech haolam, our God, King of the universe. Usually Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us with his commandments, v'tzivanu, and commanded us, fill in the blank. Lehadlik ner shel Hanukkah, light Hanukkah lights, or al achilat matzah, about the eating of matzah, or the washing of hands, or whatever. Sometimes you bless God for doing things. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe. Borei pri hagafen, who brings forth the fruit of the vine. Or hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings bread from the earth. There's also another fascinating thing to listen and laugh to, is a piece by the writer Shalom Auslander that was in This American Life about an experience he had growing up in a yeshiva of a blessing bee. In many schools you have a spelling bee, but in yeshivas you have a blessing bee, where you have to memorize what blessings are required for which foods, because there's some that's a generic blessing, and some that's a wine blessing, and some that's like a fruit blessing, some that's a ground food blessing, like potatoes are blessed differently than grapes. And what if you have something that's mixing the two together? So ice cream in a cone. Do you bless the ice cream first, or do you bless the cone first? And so this is the blessing bee, and he does a really hilarious job with that as well. But that's again an example of the rabbis want you to do what God wants and to be focused on God all the time. There's even a blessing for successfully leaving the bathroom. Thank you, God, for making me with tubes and holes that all work correctly. If any of them were obstructed or broken, life would certainly be impossible. That's basically the blessing. Now, there's also a blessing for seeing a rainbow, for seeing a king, for seeing a great learned person. I mean, there are positive mindfulness exercises we could use these blessings for, but some of them border on the obsessive compulsive. Now, the Siddur itself evolved over time too. There were new poems added, new blessings were written and created. Sometimes the Siddur is actually a citation collection where they take a line from Psalms and a line from Jeremiah and a line from here, and they plap them together. And if you have a footnoted version of a Siddur, you'll see where they pull all the verses from. And you'll see they're really just sort of cutting and pasting these good phrases together in their own kind of mashup of traditional sources. So those are the four major categories of rabbinic literature. The Mishnah, that early teachings of the early rabbis, the Gemara, the commentary, and the footnotes to that Mishnah, examples of Midrash, creative storytelling, and also creative lawmaking, and finally the liturgy, the prayers that make up the core of daily and holiday ritual practice. So any questions on any of that? We still have some primary source texts we're going to take a look at. We'll see how many we have time to get into. But I wanted to stop here and ask if you had any questions or comments on that overview of rabbinic literature as a whole.
Are they still making these laws, or whatever you want to call them, today to fit into modern society?
Well, you can't write a new Mishnah,
Right.
and you can't write a new Gemara, but you can write a new commentary.
Okay. Yeah.
And you can try to argue that maybe we have to shift the definitions here or apply it in a new way. So, as one example, the Talmud has lots of laws about like lost bodies. What if someone dies and you can't find the body? This becomes important because if they were married, is their wife free to marry someone else? Like if he died in town and they buried him, fine, she's a widow, she can marry somebody else, no question. But if he's on a boat and the boat disappears, what do you do? And they made a general ruling that if it was in an open body of water like the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, you consider them gone. If it was a closed body of water like the Sea of Galilee, then maybe you don't, because you figure the body would eventually make its way to shore. We'd find it or something, or have some trace of it. It's less likely to get totally lost. So this was applied in the 70s or 80s by the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, on missing in action from wars. Because sometimes the tank blows up and the body is burned and you have nothing left of that person. Should you allow their widow to remarry, or are they, how do you handle that? And he was very permissive in his interpretations of that sort of precedent in rabbinic law applied to new modern circumstances. So, and then you'll get people who will give a more lenient or a more strict definition. And sometimes people actually rabbi shop. Just like people judge shop when they're filing lawsuits and class action suits, you can rabbi shop for people who are more known for giving more lenient permissions and so on. I mean, the use of birth control, for example, in some Orthodox communities is controversial, and some modern Orthodox rabbis are more permissive on that, and ultra-Orthodox rabbis less so. But ironically, some women's cycles don't match their ovulation in the right way, so you actually need to use birth control to be able to get pregnant, to be able to have it predictable of when the ovulation is going to happen. Otherwise, it's not as workable. But that's, again, you have to find the right rabbi who's willing to give you the lenient ruling. So you get rulings and commentaries. You don't get new laws being written in the same way. Just like, to be honest, I do not predict in my lifetime I will ever see a constitutional amendment make it through all the steps it has to take. 3/4 of the House and the Senate and 2/3 of the states. And like, I can't imagine enough of those people agreeing on anything to pass an amendment, even if it was, have a nice day, smiley face. Like, no one's going to agree on that. So, we're not going to be making new constitutional laws. It's going to be interpretation. It's going to be Supreme Court making decisions. It's going to be the courts passing new laws, and rabbis do pass laws sometimes. So there was a 1,000-year decree for Ashkenazi Jews that banned polygamy. Polygamy was permitted according to rabbinic law. It's described in biblical stories and in rabbinic law as well, and how to handle the children of two wives and not to preference one or the other. That's clearly described in the Torah. But for Ashkenazi Jews, because they were living in a monogamous setting, a rabbi put in a 1,000-year ban on this. So he was able to do that based on rabbinic strength of law. And there's even a category of law where they define some laws as from the scripture and some laws as from the rabbis. The Torah doesn't say light Shabbat candles. The rabbis do. The Torah doesn't say read the Megillah. Of course not, because the Megillah is centuries later. But the rabbis do. So you still say, thank you, God, for commanding me to read the Megillah or light the Hanukkah candles, even though it's the rabbis that are really the ones that are telling you that God wants you to do it. And in one of those proof text sources, someone says, where did God command us to light the Hanukkah candles? Hello? And the answer is, you will appoint teachers and they will tell you what to do. That's the proof text. In other words, we're in charge. So you can make new rules. Again, it's rare, it's occasional, but they don't have the same force as the early ones. And more often you're ruling by commentary and interpretation rather than, direct sort of force of rabbinic commandment law. Because just like the Torah is more authoritative than the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is more authoritative than the Gemara, the earlier commentators are more authoritative than the later ones. And it's hard to push backwards up that, that hill of stare decisis, or set decision, to use the legal term in our practice.